Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. We're a nonprofit scientific research organization. We are funded by the U.S. property and casualty insurance industry. And it kind of came about really in the early days after Hurricane Andrew in Florida. That was a storm that caused a significant amount of loss. It was a record at the time. And that was one of the most, still to this day, is one of the most damaging hurricanes of all time after it hit Florida. And some talks from that sort of spawned about how do we build buildings stronger to prevent these losses within the insurance industry. And that's really where conversations about building codes started to come up, and eventually conversations about needing a place to conduct the research to figure out what types of science and engineering needs to be in building codes. Across the US, we don't have a national building code. That was one thing that I found really surprising, something that I didn't really think about it. I just kind of assumed that the structures that I, lived and worked in were safe, and that, the engineers had done their job in figuring out how to build those well, and that if it was damaged by, a tornado or a hurricane to some extent, I didn't really think there was all that much you could do, particularly when it comes to things like tornadoes. Um, but fast forward a few years later, the early 2000s, we began to see a building code start to be put in place across the parts of the United States. That was really the modern era of building codes. So before that, there really wasn't any type of code anywhere in the country. So the building code started to develop across the country. Florida was, of course, one of those first states to start adopting one. Today, it is left up to individual states. Building codes are updated, or there's an opportunity to update building codes every 3 years as those international codes are updated. And states can choose whether they want to adopt them or not. So many states like Florida have, and they stay pretty consistent with getting the most recent, adopting the most recent building code. So that would have the most recent science and engineering in it. So Florida is a great example of that. They have one of the strongest building codes in the country. Other states really have not adopted a building code. Texas is one of those states that experiences a range of hazards, and they do not have a statewide uniform building code. And then another aspect of it is even when states do have a building code, it's not always uniformly enforced. Sometimes it's left up to individual municipalities to amend it and change it, and they can actually choose to weaken the building code if they want. So that was kind of a big part about how IBHS all came about. And we're a big proponent of building codes. We would like the science that we do to be put into building codes. And we do a lot of policy work in that space as well, kind of advocating to improve these building codes.
You mentioned some of those outputs, I guess, of all of that research, whether it is roofing, like the fortified roofing, or maybe making buildings more strong wind resistant. As leaders are listening to this podcast and they're thinking about it, I think certainly we have that natural tendency to think about the human health safety element first. Certainly as I'm sitting in a high rise, that's what I'm thinking of right now. But there's also the financial side. And we often don't think about it until there is a situation like Hurricane Andrew that you then realize the financial impact. How should business leaders even be thinking of maybe the business case when it comes to these investments?
When building codes did start to come about, the purpose was life safety, right? That's the most important thing, is that we can survive in the buildings that we live and work in. And building codes actually were not meant to reduce or we're not meant to protect the structure necessarily, right? And make it usable or minimize the damage. So building codes were developed to save lives first. We are now starting to get into the space where we are improving those building codes to a point where we are reducing those losses. So that's a really key component about building codes that I did want to mention. So we're starting to get into places like Florida who have chosen to adopt the strong building codes so that people can survive the storms and that they can minimize the damage. That's part of our mission at IBHS. We believe that all the suffering that comes with the storms is mostly preventable by using that science and engineering. So we want people to really not have to leave their homes and shut down their businesses after a storm. We want those buildings to be usable in a very short amount of time. So yeah, I think the return on investment with resilience, that's an important thing that leaders should be thinking about. When you consider how much money would be lost if you don't have a business continuity plan and you have to shut your business down, or the building is not usable and you can't function at all. That's those are things to consider, when they're thinking about investing in these more resilient options like a fortified roof, or if it's in a hail-prone area, impact-resistant shingles. Sometimes a higher cost up front is going to pay dividends down the line when you're talking about minimizing not only insured losses, but just the time of getting back to normal and getting back to business as normal.
And in all of that research, have you seen any best practices? Let's say, I think it sounds like ideally leaders would be thinking about making these upgrades or investing in these buildings that are more resilient. But if you do face extreme weather in one form or another, are there any recommendations that you have that business leaders take within those first 24 to 48 hours to minimize longer term risk and perhaps keeping their operations going as smoothly as possible?
Well, the most important thing that you can do is have that business continuity plan in place ahead of the storm, so you're prepared for the different possible scenarios, and you have prepared as much as you can to keep your business functioning and operating as normal. After the storm, of course, assessing the damage as quickly as possible, documenting that damage before you begin the cleanup process. Making sure you thoroughly inspect. Up on the roof, if you have roof damage, chances are you could have other structural damage. You could have water intrusion, and that can trickle down into other things. Water, once it enters a building, typically amplifies the damage by about 3 times as much. So figuring out if water has made it into your building is going to be a key part, because if it has, you might have to deal with things like, replacing insulation and sheetrock, and even things like furniture. And just really thoroughly assessing the damage is going to be a key part in the immediate hours after the storm, and looking at the full picture on what you may be dealing with. Contacting your insurer, of course. That's another thing you want to know about proactively. What does the deductible cover? What all will you be covered for if a storm does hit? And then, just getting in contact with an insurance agent as soon as possible. Any, expenses, any repairs, and any temporary expenses that you have to relocate your business operations, keeping really good records, really good receipts. Consider having those receipts and everything saved electronically so you can access them as soon as possible. And then, taking further steps to mitigate any additional damage. It could be something as simple as boarding out broken windows so that water doesn't get in during the next storm. We see lots of blue tarps on buildings after, hurricanes and those big SCS events to protect, damaged roofs and prevent further water from getting in there. So simple things like that are always that you can, kind of get started with immediately after the storm in the 24 to 48 hour period.